Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this week is election week. In fact, we're recording during early voting before Election Day next Tuesday, November 4th, and I know that all of you are doing all you can to make sure your friends, neighbors, and communities of faith are taking this election season seriously. Last I looked, about 3% of the population had voted. For sure, we can do better than that. And I know for many of us, the policy implications of everything going on in the world right now are real. The government shutdown and corresponding freezing of SNAP benefits and so many other vital programs is impacting our communities, and all of that requires our attention. But the way we work for a better democracy is to encourage civic engagement, starting with voting in every election. There are important elections on the ballot right now. The constitutional amendments matter. Check out Texas Impact Substack for more on those. And many of y'all in your communities, you have school board races, local government elections, and bond elections. Those matter. So I hope that you've already voted or that you'll make a plan to vote and invite some friends to join you. Here to talk to us about elections, both the current November 4th election and our election infrastructure, is Natalia Contreras, reporter with Votebeat Texas, whose work also appears in the Texas Tribune. I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Natalia. Joining us for the conversation this week is Natalia Contreras, a reporter with Votebeat Texas, who also works in partnership with the Texas Tribune. Natalia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Natalia, I have to start with this question because I feel like everybody in my life right now, I'm starting with the exact same question. Have you voted yet? We're in early voting.
I have.
Excellent. So you passed the test. Full disclosure, we're recording this before it's released on Friday. I have not yet voted. We're going on Friday. So my family will be voting Friday morning. So talk to us before we jump in. You are with Votebeat Texas. For those who aren't familiar, talk to us about that organization.
Yes, Votebeat is great. We cover election administration and voting access. We are the only newsroom in the country, and we're a nonprofit newsroom that focuses solely on election administration and voting access. And the reason we do that is because, after the 2020 election, there were just so many questions, right, about elections in general, whether the process, was done in a way that we could trust or not. And Votebeat was born out of the need for people in our country to understand, for all of us to understand exactly how our elections work, and the fact that elections are run locally and that they're different and they vary depending on where you live. The federal government doesn't control our elections, so we don't have a uniform system of running our elections. And so that's why Votebeat was created. And so our reporting in Texas really focuses on how elections work in Texas, how we vote in Texas. And during the legislative session, I typically focus my reporting on the laws that are getting proposed or passed that would change elections, that will make voting better or maybe harder for some people. That's basically what my reporting is all about. We don't focus on, the politics of it. You won't see me reporting on what lawmaker said about this or which lawmaker is, fighting with what lawmaker, or actually what the results of the elections are. You won't see Votebeat reporting on election results. We are solely focused on the process and whether voters are able to vote, because, we should be able to do that. So
We should be able to do that. And I definitely want to talk to you about the process. I want to talk to you about what we're hearing in the Houston area and throughout the state on some of those things. But before we jump into that, I mentioned a second ago, we are in the middle of early voting. I know I turn on the news and I hear about candidates for 2026 and I hear about candidates for 2028. But there's an election going on right now in 2025. Do you feel like voters are paying attention to this election? Do you feel like the general population knows that there's an election happening?
Usually constitutional amendment elections are a very low turnout election. The Secretary of State's office just released today that 500,000 people showed up to vote so far for this election, but we have like more than 18 million registered voters in the state. So it's a low turnout election all the time. However, I do feel like locally, some cities, some jurisdictions have proposals and, issues on their ballot that they do really care about. So it may be a low turnout election for the constitutional amendments, right? The statewide amendments. But I think that locally that folks are probably turning out for specific issues that they care about. And I do think that because of that, that folks are aware that there is an election. In my county where I live, Nueces County, we really don't have anything exciting on our ballot right now. There's like no city council races. Like we don't have any type of other jurisdictions or school board races on our ballot right now. So, I went to the courthouse to vote the other day and I was like the only one in line. So I think it just depends what's on your ballot, but I do feel like people know there's an election happening, and whether you choose to go or not, that's going to be on you.
Yeah. Anything you're hearing about issues that people are particularly interested in? I know the water proposition is one that's getting attention in our circles. Anything you're hearing?
So I am like, for Houston, I know that the 18th congressional district race is getting a lot of attention. That's a seat that's been vacant since the beginning of the year. Governor Abbott waited a long time to try to fill that, until now, until the constitutional amendment election. There's a lot of people that are running for that one. So I think if you live in that district, that's probably a really contentious one and an interesting one. And what's interesting to note about that specific race is that, of course, it's been vacant all year. Voters in the 18th congressional district haven't had representation in Congress this entire time. So once you go, if you live in the 18th congressional district and you choose your candidate, I think that it's important that those voters know that because there is a redistricting battle right now going on in Texas, mid-cycle redistricting, which is, rare that it happens. And then, Texas is always in the middle of a redistricting race or battle, it seems like. Whoever you choose for the 18th congressional district as your candidate, depending on what happens with redistricting, whoever wins that race may end up on the ballot again in March when you go to vote in the primary. So also, depending on what happens with redistricting, if the maps do change for next year, you may end up voting for your 18th congressional district candidate right now. But depending on what happens with those maps, you may end up living in a completely different district. So the person that you voted for may not even represent you. And I know that's really confusing, but it's just something to keep in mind, and something that I think it's really interesting. I haven't seen a lot of discussion about that. I'm sure the candidates are talking to their constituents about it. When they're knocking on doors and campaigning, and there's been town halls in Houston about that and about the redistricting in general. But that is just something that I think it's important for voters to know. And I know a few voters that I talked to about this issue specifically. It could be upsetting that you're voting for one person and then you end up just being in a completely different district, and that person you voted for may not even end up representing you. And that's the entire dilemma, I think, in voting in Texas. This is kind of what we encounter when redistricting is happening.
Yeah, and I want to come back to redistricting a little bit, but I do think you raise a good point that that there are different things on the ballot in each community. Some of you, not a whole lot of you, but some of you are voting for congressional candidates. Many of you are voting in school board races, and our public school defenders team has been talking about the important role that school board members play in the current landscape in Texas. So I'd encourage you to check out who's running at the school board level if you have those races, who's running at the city council races. But one election, and you've mentioned it, that everybody in Texas has a chance to vote on are these constitutional amendments. And I know our colleague Rebecca has done some really great Substack posts talking about those constitutional amendment elections. But is there anything in there that you hope people are paying special attention to?
I mean, there is one amendment that has to do with voting, and it's one that would clarify the state constitution to make sure that only citizens vote in Texas. This is already a requirement that's in our state law. It's already in the Constitution, but this amendment would add it, like, it would make it explicit, like that there's no doubt, no confusion. And that's kind of what, Republican lawmakers who proposed this mentioned whenever they were talking about this as an amendment during the legislative session. It's, we want to make it clear. And it's interesting because this push for, to prevent non-citizens from voting has, been a debate for years now. It rarely happens. When it does happen, when non-citizen voting happens, it rarely changes any outcomes of any elections. It has serious consequences, but there's just no evidence that non-citizens are voting in mass. So this effort of just preventing it and making it really clear, I think it's really interesting. So that's one amendment that, like I said, I think it's already clear in state law, and federal law requires that folks are citizens, and that, that's what makes you eligible to vote. But yeah, it's just interesting that it's also something that, that we're really voting to put it clear and in writing and just reinforce it in our state constitution. So that's one that has to do with voting that I'm paying attention to.
Excellent. I appreciate that. And again, if you have questions about other constitutional amendments, we've certainly put information about out there. I know a lot of other organizations have as well. But one of the things that you mentioned at the top that you are kind of laser focused on are our voting systems and our voting processes. And so I know there's been a lot of conversation in the legislature over the last couple of sessions about this. And I know it's something that our listeners wonder about often. So talk to us about some of those changes. Are there changes in systems, or are they more changes in processes? What's different this election cycle?
That is interesting. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I think, it's important that folks know that depending on where you live, the way that you vote may not be the same, as the county next door. But, the president earlier this year issued an executive order on elections, and there was, a lot to unpack there. But one thing that he mentioned in that executive order that has impacted some of the way in which we vote here in the state includes, barcodes on paper ballots. I think all but maybe one or two tiny counties in Texas already use a paper ballot backup. So you get a blank paper that then you enter into a machine, you make your selections into a screen, or maybe you bubble in your selections. It depends, right? They're all different, but there's always a paper backup in our systems. Some counties use a system that prints out a barcode, and what that barcode has is basically it helps the computer differentiate between your ballot style, like the races that you get on your ballot and the races that I get on my ballot, depending on our address, right, and our, what district we live in or precinct we live in. But the president wants to get rid of those barcodes altogether. So that order has been challenged, in court, but that specific provision of his executive order hasn't been challenged. So And at the same time, the president can't just dictate how the states do their elections and how local entities run their elections. But I think in Texas, some election officials in some counties know that our situation right now in our country is so fluid. Like, you never know what's going to happen, who the president's going to fire, who the president's going to keep an eye, and so some counties, to prevent any sudden just like mandate that they have to entirely change their voting system and, the equipment that they use, just went ahead and made the decision to make a change. So for example, Collin County and Bastrop County and Williamson County, which are pretty large, they have pretty large populations, voters used to select their races and their choices, make their selections using a touchscreen. And so those counties this election are bubbling in a piece of paper that doesn't produce a barcode or anything. Like I said, the barcode, there's no evidence that shows that a barcode does anything, or that it alters anything in your ballot. But again, it's just, I think for a lot of election officials, it's also a matter of perception. And if this is something this is what they've told me and why they decided to make that change. If this is what, helps their community have more trust in the process, then that's what they're going to do. And I will note, and I know that I just mentioned a lot, but I'll note that whether you're touching, with a voting machine that you touch screen, or you're bubbling in, both of those systems are fine. They're secure. There's an audit before and after an election. So those are double, triple checked every time. And so it's just a matter of what works for one county versus another. But it's one thing that, because of that executive order from the president, that's one thing that definitely impacted how some folks in Texas, cast their ballot.
I know you're a reporter who's covering this stuff. I wonder if you've had any conversations with the Secretary of State's election division or folks in the Houston area about how they're feeling about implementing this election cycle.
Oh yeah, I am at conferences where the Secretary of State's office and the elections division is there. Typically elections, and even this one, it's a small election, they're usually okay. There's usually no major problems. A lot of people, I think, leading to the presidential election were worried, that there was going to be problems with it or anything, but usually they're fine. I think a lot of the issues that may come up, we'll see after, because there's so much that has to be done, so many numbers that have to be gathered. There was not just the results, but just so many other things that election officials have to put together to present as final evidence. So this is how many people voted. This is how many people couldn't vote because, X, Y, and Z, or, all of these things that have to be reported up to the state. So if there are any problems, I think we're going to find out after. Leading up to this election, I did report on issues with the state's voter registration system, the software that election officials across the state, the system that they use to manage, to prepare, and to do voter roll maintenance. There was just so many problems with it, and they're still experiencing problems with it right now. This is a system that they've used for years, but that the Secretary of State's office this year, for a year, has been working on just redesigning and just redeveloping. And the redesign of it, this new system that they launched it this summer, has had a lot of problems. It just hasn't worked well. And no matter how small or large an election is, it takes months to prepare. It's almost like, I compare it to planning a wedding. You gotta really know, okay, how many people are going to show up? How much paper are going to need? How many workers are going to have to be working? Are they all confirmed that they're going to show up? How many voting machines do we have to place in the locations? What if we can't use this location instead of this other one? Like, there's just so many moving parts. Election officials plan for an election months in advance. So with the problems with the system that I've been tracking and keeping an eye on, they weren't able to do things like pull up a list of people who have requested a mail-in ballot, for example. And you need that list because you need to know who you're going to mail your mail-in ballot to, right? Like you need to know who has requested a mail-in ballot. Who do we need to send it to? And if they can't pull that list on time, like they may be running behind, right? Like those were the type of problems they were dealing with. Or, if they were processing voter registration applications, since we don't have online voter registration in our state, it's still a process that's done by manually entering data into that system. Another problem that they were finding was that they're trying to enter voters' information and it wasn't saving. Can you imagine like when you're working on something and it just doesn't save, you have to start all over? It's nightmarish.
Nightmare.
So those are the type of problems that election officials dealt with ahead of the election. And in the middle of it, I'm just kind of watching to see if everything works smoothly by the time that they have to enter results and, in the days after the election. Even though it's a low turnout election, it still matters. And there's still voters that, want to make sure that everything is done, the way that it should be, right? So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that, definitely.
So we have a lot of listeners who care about elections. And I know a couple of years ago, we were really asking for help with volunteers and lots of different things because it does take a ton of people to put this on. What would you like to see an informed constituency doing to support elections during this upcoming year?
I report on so many different topics and problems, that election officials run into with elections, with the logistical part of it. And every issue that I cover, no matter what, always the core problem always goes back to funding. The state doesn't fund elections enough. The state doesn't allocate a lot of money to voter education. That's why you rarely see any information, or you have to go looking for it. Right? It's like you don't see a commercial about it, or you may see something on social media, but it's not obvious, or like in other places. Locally, depending on the county and its size, that most of the time dictates the amount that a county elections office will get in their budget to actually run the election, to acquire equipment, to pay workers, etc. So I think voters should know that it's just a lot of it, if you want a really good election system, if you want a really good, if you want a really well-run and secure election, it's not something that you do, it's not something that is cheap. And I think in our state and a lot of counties, I've seen just local leaders just wanting it, but not really investing in it. And so I think it would do a lot if voters across the state, our state, would be aware that having safe and secure elections in our state requires a lot of funding. And we don't get that much money from the federal government. Counties allocate whatever they can as, they need. But, this is, what makes our democracy. And I personally think, and, my opinion as a reporter, it's really doesn't matter out there, right? You got to make your own decision. But in my opinion, I think we should invest in elections as much as we invest in our public safety, in our fire departments, and our police departments. This is the foundation and the core of our democracy. And it's just very important, dear to my heart, right? So I think if we are aware of that, I think a lot of things would start to make sense, and why some things work and some other things don't. Another thing is that if you are able to, or if you really care about politics, or you really care just about elections in general or voting, getting involved and just like really volunteering, right, to maybe be a deputy voter registrar, like try to register voters in your community. And then you get to see part of that system and how it works, just one part of it. But if you maybe, sign up to be a poll worker, you'll have to go through poll workers training. I actually was allowed to attend a poll worker training in a really, it was just fascinating.
That's cool.
All of the laws that poll workers have to be aware of and know to work the polls. Sign up to be a poll worker, volunteer if you can, when it's like high election season. Some counties will bring in volunteers to do that manual data entry that I mentioned, to like input all of those voter registration applications into our system, like things like that actually will give you so much like insight into how the process works in your community, because in your community it works one way, but then, for another county or, your neighbors, it might work differently. But in your community, I think like those are the best things to do in order to help our local election offices and our local election officials.
And I think that's really important, especially for communities of faith, for congregations who care about democracy, who care about our community. It is really important that we have people of good conscience who are volunteering and serving in all these roles, especially when we're in a climate where people might cast doubt on election results and that kind of thing, to know that there are outstanding members of the community who are a part of this process. And to make sure there are enough people there to make sure that we have as many polling places as possible open and staffed, right? I know we've heard of communities in the past who had to close polling locations because there weren't enough personnel. And so it's really important that we recruit and we encourage people to serve in those roles. So I think that's a good and important word. Anything else to add there before we move to what's coming next?
No, I think if folks get involved and, get to know their local election official, I think a lot of the doubts, a lot of your doubts would be cleared. One thing that you hear a lot on these debates that scrutinize elections and folks that don't have trust in the process is, they don't understand why, the numbers of the results are one way, or they say one thing and then they change later. Like, how could they change like 2 days later? And it's, if you just understood that there are still like mail-in ballots that are getting counted and that are coming in from overseas, from, military members, or that, just regular mail-in ballots that are coming in later, or provisional ballots that end up getting counted, even though they might have not been included in the initial results. Those like basic, there's always an explanation in my experience and what I've learned through my reporting. There's always an explanation. You just gotta get to know the folks that do the work. And one more thing that I'll say to that is, I think people forget that the people that are running our elections in our communities are members of our communities, like our neighbors. Like you mentioned, they go to church with us. They go to school with us. You see them at the grocery store, like they're part of your community. And I think they care about it as much as you do. But I think it's easy to forget that a lot of times.
Yeah, it's an important word. You mentioned earlier in the conversation about redistricting, and certainly for those who follow along with this program, we talked about redistricting quite a bit over the course of the summer. Any update on where that is and what we're expecting in the coming weeks? Is that a done deal? It's in the courts. Where are we?
It is not a done deal. It is in the courts. So right now, there's, of course, lawmakers redrew our maps, and there was a challenge, right? There's a lawsuit on that, and it's getting heard in El Paso. A 3-panel judge is still set to make a decision on whether these new maps, the 2025 maps that were just redrawn this summer, are going to be used for next year, or if they're not going to be used and we're just going to stay status quo with the maps that were drawn back in 2021. So we're waiting on that. We're waiting to hear what the decision is. A couple of things to keep in mind. We're probably going to have a decision on that here pretty soon, because candidates for the March primary ballot they need to start filing pretty soon. In November, that starts, and the deadline to file is in December. So those candidates need to know, am I going to be running and using which map? So that's a decision that we're expecting here pretty soon. It'll be interesting to see what the decision is. And I say that because the 2021 maps are also being challenged in court. If you think about it, there's a challenge saying these 2025 maps are not good. Don't use them. But there's also a challenge in court for the 2021 maps that it's kind of like very similar argument. So I think regardless, we're going to be using maps that folks argue are terrible and discriminate against certain voters and dilute the power of certain voters. And so I think that's really interesting. But for just urgency's sake, we need to know, candidates need to know, election officials need to know what they're going to be working with. Because like I said, planning for the primary, especially for a primary election, that's a big election, that decision needs to come soon, because folks need to figure out what they're going to be working with, and where they need, candidates specifically, where they're going to be knocking on doors, right? Like, what are their districts going to look like? So yeah, we should be having a decision here pretty soon, in the coming weeks. It's literally kind of already November. So
yeah, I should say, we are recording this on October 29th. So if news has broken since this episode has been recorded, I guess we'll give an update soon. But you're right. When people listen to this, it will likely be November, and so we expect something soon. Any talk you want to give us? I know we've talked about it on this podcast, but on the impact that these and we should say these are for the congressional maps here in Texas. Any word you want to leave us with the impact of these new maps?
Well, I mean, these new maps, I mean, the reason that this happened was partisan, right? Like, our president, was worried that he's going to be losing support, from the House in the upcoming year. And so it was kind of like a mandate that, some states had to do this. Texas is doing it. But of course, like, if these new maps go into place, there is that risk that some voters' voting power may be diluted over others. Or like I mentioned earlier, there's a chance in that one district that's on the ballot right now that you may end up being represented by somebody completely different, that you may be used to being in a Democrat-leaning district for years, and now all of a sudden you're going to be in a Republican district led by a Republican candidate, and that wasn't your choice. So that, I think, it's the impact here for voters. And this is kind of like the issue that you always encounter with redistricting. And Texas has had issues with this since at least the 1970s. The state has been challenged over how they redraw the lines of the districts ever since. And ever since, the state has been found that it violates the Voting Rights Act. And so I expect this to keep happening. But it's something, like I said, I think this is just kind of like the story of how we vote here in Texas, and, what lawmakers decide and keep proposing in changes into how we vote. But I think ultimately what we can do is just stay vigilant and staying informed in what's happening. But specifically, honestly, in our local communities more than anything, I think that's the one thing that we can do as voters.
And last question, one other voting related issue that has been in the news recently is the effort by some to try to close the primaries here in Texas. Historically, I don't know how historically, but in recent history anyway, folks have been able to go in on primary election day and decide which primary election they want to vote in. And there's an effort by some to close those to where you'd have to register to vote in a particular primary. Any updates on that in terms of where we are in the process or any reporting on that?
Yes, I'm actually working on a story about that with an update here pretty soon. So what we're waiting on, so the Republican Party of Texas wants to close the primaries. This is not a process that, a judge can just say, okay, go ahead. And it's not a judge can say, yes, go ahead, but it's not something that can happen overnight. We don't have a system in place in our state that's set up for closed primaries. So our entire system would have to change if that were to happen. And that could take several months or years for it to happen, right? If that were to happen right now, I think all of us would have to go and re-register to vote and state party affiliation. And I'm trying to also wrap my mind around how we could do that, so that's going to be part of my reporting. But immediately in the lawsuit, what's happening is that Ken Paxton, of course, who's Ken Paxton, our Attorney General, who typically represents the state in these cases, is siding with the Republican Party and wants the Secretary of State to agree to close the primaries. The Secretary of State is expected to release a response in that lawsuit here pretty soon. And so I'm going to be reporting on what the Secretary of State's office response is to this, which is also interesting on itself, because usually Ken Paxton represents the Texas Secretary of State. And in this case, they're kind of going against each other, if you will. So that's also very interesting. But I have questions that I'm going to be trying to answer in my reporting. If this were to happen, how would it look like? What would we as voters have to do? What does the Republican Party envision with this, right? Are they gonna just have everybody go to their local Republican Party office and register there? Do we have to pay anything? So I am also going to be reaching out to other states that have closed primaries and see how that works. But I will say it's interesting that this is an effort that's being done by Republicans here because Republicans have the majority in the state. The issue that they have with this, and this is what they say in their lawsuit, is that they don't like that with open primaries, Democrats are likely voting in the Republican primary and are electing, moderate Republicans as opposed to more far right Republicans, which is, interesting. But also ultimately, we've kept, Texas have stayed pretty, solid red for years and years and years and years. And I'd be curious to see how this ends up impacting their own electorate, if there's an impact, if anything. So that's kind of where I want to get some of those answers in my reporting. But yeah, I'm definitely working on something right now, and we're just waiting to see what the decision is here, but it might take some time.
We'll definitely look forward to reading your reporting there. Natalia, really appreciate the time today. Any closing thoughts or shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with today, other than reading your article about closed primaries in the coming days?
No, just that if you are really into voting, election administration and, just voting in general, just please go to our website, is votebeat.org. And we have free newsletters. Our reporting is all free. There's no paywalls, which is also another thing that I love. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
All right, Natalia, you're amazing. Thank you so much for the time today. And thanks for your work you do on behalf of Texans, keeping us informed every day. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. I hope if you're listening to this podcast, I don't have to give the rah-rah speech about voting. But I will remind you that you have influence. If you're listening to this podcast and made it to the end of the conversation with Natalia, then you are an expert. I say that to say that you know more than most of the people that you interact with on a weekly basis, so use that influence and encourage your networks to vote in this and every election. As always, Texas Impact has tools for you. Check out Texas Impact's Texas Faith Votes campaign. Encourage your congregation to get involved in that work and join one of our other teams in an issue area that interests you. Learn more about that and so much more on the Action Center page at texasimpact.org. The website has so many great resources for you in your advocacy journey, so spend some time there and then check out our Substack and all of the social media channels, including Texas Impact's Ledge TV playlist on our YouTube channel, which is a great resource to help you share the story of what's happening. While you're on the website, I hope you'll take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for more just and equitable Texas. It's a very effective and affordable way to put your values into action. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.